we like to talk about. The second thing that we would like to talk about, and would be the subject of our conversation, is this issue of Europeanness, and to the extent that we can talk about identity. What is that? Do we have it? Do we need it for Europe to become resilient and to be imaginative in all the challenges that it's going to face, that are coming to it from abroad? And when I ran this topic by you, you came up with a very interesting response to that, in which you said, well, Europe is really in a midlife crisis. And in fact, we like that so much, we made it the title of this conversation. So we are going to ask you in a minute to let us in that metaphor, what you mean by midlife crisis. And you made me think what midlife crisis is. Do I know that I am in a midlife crisis? How do I recognize that I might be in a midlife crisis? And what makes midlife crisis distinct from any other crisis that anybody would have to go through in their life? And by the way, why midlife? Do you have sort of an expiring date in your mind? And importantly, how does one, if we are in one, how do we come out of it? But in the spirit of giving that a conversation, before we do that, I would also like to give you an opportunity to respond to what we heard in the first conversation between Ivan and Guntram, and then take it from there.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to Bruegel, one of the probably the best think tank in Europe. And when I got the invitation, I thought, what does it mean? It can only mean two things. Either it's going really well, and they can afford to invite someone who's talking a little bit entertaining about Europe and stuff, or it's very serious. And they need people, other people than economists. Normally there's a finance minister here or a central banker or some serious person with lots of data and and graphs. And now you have people like Ivan and me here. What does it mean? So you figure this out in the end.
Oh, no, we have.
Anyway, in a way it's very nice for me to be here, because tomorrow actually my book comes out, so this is the first time I talk about it. But let me tell you a story. I wrote a book 2 years ago called Analog is the New Organic, Analog ist das neue Bio. And that was fairly successful in Germany, digitalization, funny, stuff like that. And when my publishing house came to me and said, you have to write another book, you have to sort of reap the benefits of this. And I said, okay, I write a book about Europe. And I said, no, it's not, it won't sell. We've done books on Europe, and these things are in the bookshops and no one is interested. Can you just write another book on analog or digital or something like that? And I said, no, I want to write on Europe. And then I said, how can I sell this to my publishing house? And I said, basically the issue is, if you go into a bookshop and you look at the books on Europe, it's all Europe is failing, Europe is in crisis, everything is going down the drain. I will write a positive and an optimistic book about Europe. And I said, and do you know that 2017 will be the turning point? This will be the end of the crisis, or the beginning of the end of the crisis, 2017. I predicted, and then the book comes out, and then it will be the book to the return of Europe. And they like that. So in that sense, so that's my pitch to the publishing house. We did this book. I took a topic which people usually refer to when they say, even the optimistic people, they say Europe is a good idea in principle, but look at this bureaucracy. So I turn it around and say, actually bureaucracy is quite a good thing. So I started with the most hardcore issue when you come with prejudices against Europe. I turned it around, I did this with other things. It's a very personal book and so on. But coming back to the issue of midlife crisis, or crisis of identity. Anyway, midlife crisis, of course, Europe is 60. What does it mean? It's obviously demographics. The 60s is the new 40s, and in that sense, it makes total sense that Europe has a midlife crisis at 60. And anyway, this crisis is already going on for 10 years, so it's not something which happens now. It started 10 years ago, I think it is it is actually a crisis of identity, because Europe was built on the basis of always forward, everything is working out, always bigger, always better, enlargement, in any sense, we will manage. Any new project coming up, we will manage. And it worked. It worked amazingly well for a long time. And I think my turning point was 2005 or 2006, the referendum in Holland and in Netherlands and France. And that was, for me, the turning point, because that was really the first issue where Europe failed. Because they thought everything was going well, including the enlargement to Eastern Europe, 2004. That, in a way, was the biggest moment in many ways, because it was not only the unification of Germany, but also the unification of Europe. And then came 2005, 2006, and that when the identity crisis started. Soon afterwards, we had the financial crisis. And these two events together, for me, basically are the crucial points where Europe started to lose confidence. Confidence in itself, nothing worked anymore. You had the Greek problem, you had Southern Europe, youth unemployment, and so on. And it created this sense we cannot manage anymore. And in that sense, I think we have a midlife crisis, maybe a serious identity crisis. Since I'm an author, I don't need to go through the economic argument. I actually took the EU to Freud. I took the EU to Sigmund Freud and went through a session. So how does a session at Sigmund Freud would look like for the EU? If you read my book, it comes, actually it starts because it's a personal book. I used to be the neighbor of Sigmund Freud, if he had to be still alive. Because I lived in London, in Hampstead, next door to the Sigmund Freud Museum, which was his last residence. And so it develops. I spent quite a lot of time in the Sigmund Freud Museum. And so I know the surroundings. And so I went through the whole process. But how would it look like? In my sense, the EU is a sort of rather attractive middle-aged lady which had a lot of successes in her life, lots of lovers and so on. A difficult father, which I call him the fatherlands, sort of someone with a multipolar disorder. The mother is Europe. Mother Europe, and this relationship was difficult. I create a woman which became strong through fear, because her parents always instilled in her a lot of fear from the past, and that was a driving force. And when this fear disappeared, she kind of lost her way. Because everything was going well, and the communists disappeared, and everything was getting into order, the end of history, and then this woman lost her identity, and now she comes to Freud and looking for revelations. So of course you have to read my book to understand how it works out in the end. But I think it needs new approaches to dealing with this kind of identity crisis. I'm looking in my way as an author, as someone who lived in the Brussels bubble, and in that sense, I can tell you, I've lived here for 13 years in Brussels. I knew all the language. I was basically part of it. I went back to Germany, and people didn't understand me. And after 1 year being in Germany, coming back and still dealing a lot with European issues, coming back to a meeting, I think the European Council on Foreign Relations, I didn't understand the people here anymore. So there is really an issue of language, and if you talk about Europe, even in Germany, in a sense of political actors, you have already a problem telling people how the Brussels circus works. And if you then even try to explain it to someone who is not part of the political elite, it's even more complicated. So I think maybe one of the things we can talk about more is how can you find a language on Europe which is different to the kind of language we have, which is very factual, very economic, very common sense. We have to get more passion in, optimism. It's not post-factual, but it's a question of not only factual. And that's what I tried to do with Freud, and I have a dystopia at the end which comes out in a positive way. Is that an answer to your question? Anyway, maybe coming still back to the question of identity, I think, and that may be one conclusion out of the issue with Freud, is when you have a midlife crisis, fortunately I haven't had one, or maybe a mild one, usually if you then go to a shrink, and we have all seen Woody Allen films, he or she, the analyst, doesn't tell you all the time, you're really shit, it will never work out, you will stay here for whatever time, everything is going down the drain, everyone else is better than you, but they start off saying, well, there were a few good things, you have achieved quite a number of things, there's a lot to go for you, and sort of it's a confidence building again, and I think that's something the EU and Europe has to start investing in. That's my one-point plan for Europe, rebuilding confidence.
But can I ask you, I mean, so you believe that Europe is much more than just geography, it is identity, but what is that? How does one go about becoming and feeling a European? I mean, and what do you need to do to say, now I'm a better European, or I feel European? And symbols matter in this respect, and languages matter in this. If you talked about language and the inability to communicate, I mean, language frames views, frames discussions, and frames views, and in Europe, I mean, one of the richness of Europe is its diversity, but is that becoming really an abstraction, the diversity, and so a threat to the future of Europe, or can you really think that a common denominator, and hopefully not the lowest common denominator, can really be something to build on? You talked about fear as a way of, in your metaphor, fear as sort of the driving force behind the genesis of Europe. Is this sufficient? Is fear sufficient? I mean, the fear of exits, of Brexit, Grexit, Frexit, you name it. Is that fear, sufficient for Europe to be able to build on and develop that thing that you call identity? And perhaps, do we need identity for Europe to be successful? I mean, if you believe in Europe being an economic agreement, or if you believe it being a political agreement, do you still need that identity to make that success?
Well, certainly fear is not enough, and I said it was very important at the beginning of the European Union. The fear of the past, the fear of wars, the fear of communism and so on, but it's certainly not enough. But anyway, there's a certain return of fear, the fear that maybe the past is coming back, maybe nationalism is coming back, maybe even war is coming back. And so on. But let me come to identity. And when after nearly 20 years I moved back to Germany, my wife, my British wife, said, well, Berlin is a great idea and we should certainly try, but and Berlin is really cool, but too many Germans. And I think she was absolutely right. No, but that was in 2009, and she was absolutely right. Berlin was still, in a way, quite a relatively provincial town in a sense, not comparable to Brussels or London or New York. It has changed, partly because of the crisis, where we had an influx of people from Spain, from Italy, from Greece, from the UK, from the US. So it's a much more international place.
Cosmopolitan, yeah.
Cosmopolitan place. And, that's why I like it there. I didn't like it, certainly, you know, I come from East Germany, I didn't like that situation, so the moment the war came down, I got into a Lada, a Russian car, and drove to Brussels to start an internship at the European Commission here. So that's my story. I feel, first of all, I'm a Berliner. Ich bin ein Berliner. So in a certain context, I feel very much like a Berliner. When I watch football, I feel very much like a German. There's nothing I can do. This is how it is. Yeah, but it was strange for me because I didn't feel particularly German, but in football, you can't escape it. So sometimes I feel East German or an East Berliner when it comes to issues like, in a way, like, you know, how you look at questions of equality and consumer society. I think there's a difference also in Germany in that context. But when I'm in China or when I'm in the US, I certainly feel European. And I think that's quite a normal way of dealing with it. You don't have to overstretch on sort of a European identity that, you know, in every single moment I have to feel European. You know, there's a chapter in a book on Switzerland, because I lived in Switzerland, and I was actually quite astonished when I read up on the history of Switzerland. That is quite similar to how the European Union developed, but they took 800 years to develop. That's why I call it the Swiss Langeweile, sort of the long distance, but in Germany it also means boredom. Strangely enough. But they developed this over a long period. They had ups and downs. They have a very strong identity of the cantons. So you have to be firstly you are a citizen of your canton, and then you are a Swiss citizen. And I think this, looking at Switzerland as an example of how you, over a long period with ups and downs, develop an identity, is interesting. So sometimes I think we're too aggressive in saying, you know, we all have to have a European identity. I think we have a mixed identity where you know, the Germanness plays a role, even if it's only in football. The local level plays a very important role, and I think that's fine.
Well, if I may ask one more question, which goes a little bit kind of in tangent with what you're saying, and then I would like to bring our public into the conversation. I mean, it helps if Europe is successful for us to feel more European. And you know, the other way around, when Europe isn't successful, then of course it's easier to blame Europe, and usually that's Brussels, for all its bad. But I think, can we take a moment to, given that we are celebrating the 60 years of the treaty, of the signing of the Treaty of Rome, can we take a minute to go back and revisit that? And I would ask you a difficult question, but one that I would be very interested to hear what you think, and that is, what do you think, where would you and I be if the Treaty of Rome were never signed? And you and I are symbols rather than as persons, but...
Well, that was actually one of the... when I more or less had written the book, and of course I had to revisit the book after Brexit and stuff. I was in London where the family of my wife is. We're always there for Christmas. And every Christmas there's basically the usual program of Strictly Come Dancing and these sort of things. And then they play always, or they have on TV always this one film.
The Sound of Music?
No, it's A Wonderful Life, or The Wonderful Life with James Stewart. Basically, this is a story where a guy you know, wants to throw himself off the bridge because nothing is going well, and a guardian angel comes and shows him what the world would be without him. And so I thought, maybe I play this through. So, and actually in my book I play this through. So there's a whole chapter, what would be, the Mrs., I call her Europa Union, is at the top of the Berlaymont and wants to throw herself down. because too many problems, everything is going wrong, and the guardian angel, in my case called Kant, comes and saves her and say, I show you. And they're traveling around Europe. And that was, in a way, fun to create a dystopia of Europe without the European Union. And in a way, after reading it, I mean, it was fun. For example, Greece becomes the Silicon Valley of Europe, where everything is invented. Soviet Union, East Germany is integrated into Soviet Union. It becomes kind of a China. After Gorbachev comes with capitalism, with a socialist phase and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, Monet, after being rejected with his plan for the coal and steel community, went to Beirut and sold his plan there, and so the Arab Union is created as a kind of the European Union now, but it's actually Arab countries have created this space of peace and stability and prosperity. Europe is still divided, basically playing national games. And interestingly for me, and maybe that's also when we come to Germany, Germany was kept divided because there was actually the Morgenthau plan. After the war, the finance minister of the US said we have to deindustrialize Germany. It should become an agricultural state. And so that was done in my dystopia. The French kept their part of French Germany, it's called, as an agricultural land. The British kept there as an agricultural land, and the Americans made it into a military base. East Germany got reintegrated into the Soviet Union and became a successful Soviet state with a lot of production and so on, and actually the chancellor, or no, what is it called, the head of the Central Committee of East Germany was on his way to become the head of the Central Committee of the Soviet Union because he was so successful. It was a woman also. Anyway, so it was quite interesting to see this and go through the motions, and it made me also realize how important, and people totally forget, how important the issue of Germany was for the unification of Europe. Because the European Union in many ways was also created to keep Germany integrated. And that was a real success story. I mean, we can talk how it ended up now, but it was a success story. All sorts of other options would have been possible. But the integration of Germany into a successful European enterprise is probably one of the biggest success story of the last 60 years. And that made me realize when I read up on the history after the war, the Morgenthau plan and all these kind of things, that certainly with the integration of Germany, and when Ivan talked about Germany being an unusual state now because everything is working relatively well. It's so unusual, but that it is so unusual in a sense that it is actually working relatively well. It's because these decisions were taken in 1955, 57, and that Germany has been integrated to a sense that it can be now, to a certain extent, also an anchor in Europe, hopefully in a positive direction. And if you read my book, you will be totally convinced that we are on the path to European optimism.
So, well, thank you for that. And I wasn't really expecting quite such a detailed forecast of how Europe would have looked like. But I'm beginning to see your story. But let me ask our public to contribute. There's a gentleman here.
Yes, it is working. Hello, my name is Professor Linson. I'm a neuroscientist. I'd like to ask you, but before, in fact, I have two questions for the preceding panel, but I won't go into that in depth. But To my mind, Europe needs to look in the mirror and learn from its mistakes. I'm not very optimistic. And also, hang on a second. Yes, I'm a strong disagreement regarding power. The third millennium's top priority is achieving and sustaining the citizens' well-being, quality of life, not power. Now, my question is, why is there a need for an identity in the first place? I'm half Flemish. I don't feel half Flemish. I don't even feel Belgian. I don't even feel European. I am a citizen of the world, period. I don't need all these identities. They would clutter up my mind quite uselessly, and I feel perfectly well balanced without the need to cling to an identity. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here. Let's just collect a couple, and then
No.
we can both. Yeah, and it's just the gentleman here with the red tie. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Joost van Eersel of the European Economic and Social Committee. Lots of questions. I limit myself to one.
Please, so we can give the chance to others as well.
And that is the generational discrepancy. You know that by 2007, Stephen Shakespeare invented a nice expression. He made a difference between the drawbridge uppers and the drawbridge downers. The drawbridge uppers are those who refuse globalization and openness. The drawbridge downers, by contrast, applaud it. And when you look at the younger generations, by and large, they are downers. When you see the reaction in the United Kingdom that has lost completely its way, in all respects, of the youth over there, since the 23rd of June of this year, last year, it's amazing. It's not only amazing in the UK, it's also amazing in France. It's also amazing in the Netherlands, the country I know best. So what do you think when you are speaking of an old girl and you are...
Middle-aged.
Pas op.
Timothy Ashton Garsh speaks about an old girl and he says there's still life in it. Okay, now you speak of a middle-aged girl with more life maybe. But in fact, our populations are changing history. And the future is to youth. And when you look at it from that point of view, how would you consider the situation as it is?
Okay, thank you. There's a question at the back, and then we'll have a second round. We'll have a second round. Just there at the back, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, and we bring a message of optimism, not on the words, but on practical. All around the roads, the streets, the squares in Europe, they are discussing our ideas, the Eco Waves movement. It's an underground movement right now, and we are waiting the chance so that to be on the ground, like most of you are. I don't like to speak for this, but I'll give you an example. I'm facing the last 2 days participating to the Clean Sky project on the hotel. Over there, the Clean Sky is Europe, for example. It has a 4 billion budget. It's aerospace and aeronautics. So they have a problem because they are trying to announce the Clean Sky 3. Now it's the initiation of the Clean Sky 2. But they have a problem because of the Brexit. And the solution which I'm proposing to the citizens, and I didn't have the chance to give it there because I have to be here with you, is that the Europe we know, it has finished. The Europe which comes from the let's say, from the Rome treaties is an economical Europe. Europe is not only economy. Europe is a lot of other things. So my suggestion to the Clean Sky, it is that as it is mainly financed by the Commission and British is a big facilitator to this finance, is going to be out as they believe. We don't believe so. We have our political techniques to oppose this thing. So we propose that the Clean Sky should follow the European Space Agency administrative and be out of the Commission's ordinates, and or to the European Defence Agency, which these agencies, the United Kingdom, is going to participate because they are independent agencies. They are not inside the Commission, and so they can operate through this kind of operation where UK will still be contributing to the European nations. Thank you very much.
Let me just come back, Andre, with a couple of questions. You know, why do we need an identity? I mean, I think that's, you know, it's not just a question for Europe, it's a question for every nation as well. Then there is an intergenerational issue, and the young versus the old. Europe is more than just economics. What do you think?
Yes.
But if the economics doesn't work,
no, but let's start with the identity. I think maybe theoretically one could say, of course, we don't need an identity, but it's a matter of fact that people have identities, multiple identities. And there was recently a very good essay in the Financial Times. What's his name? The undercover economist or so. He wrote.
Sandro, yeah? Martin Sandro?
No, the other one, Hartford or whatever. Anyway, he talked about identity as the clash between the nowheres and the somewheres. Yeah. And in effect, David Coulthard. Somewhere and anywhere. Somewhere and anywheres. And sort of you are basically an anywhere. You are an anywhere, it doesn't matter where you are, you know, the life is great, and you know, you could be in the US or here, it doesn't matter. This is a very small fraction of society. Most people live somewhere, and they are the people who decide the elections, the somewheres, and they have decided the election in the UK, and they have decided the election in the US. So I think you have to deal with the issue of identity somehow, and simply from that perspective. But it's also a matter of fact. You know, I have identities. I have this identity. I could say I should have more of a European identity, but that's not what I'm saying. I think it has to develop, and as I said, in Switzerland, it developed over 800 years, and it's still not perfect, and probably someone from the Valais will say, first of all, I'm from the Valais, and then maybe I'm also Swiss. But, you know, this is something...
Don't you think we should go back to education?
Back to education, I think education plays a role, but I think there is not so much we should do in terms of propaganda, in terms of, you know, the Commission now should have another identity, or maybe set up an identity agency or something. Yeah? You know, that's usually what they do, or when they really run out of ideas, they create a union, sort of a banking union, or you know, now they create their identity union or something. You know, I don't think I don't think that's the plan. I think I think we should give ourselves time. These things will develop. You can't just rush it. And I think we're in a good direction. And things like Trump and Brexit and Putin and Erdogan in a way they help.
But can I ask you, what is the function of identity? Is it unifying or is it divisive? I mean, is it just about supporting football teams, or is it just more than that? And I'm stretching the argument here, but you know, can you think of a Europeanness as an identity being something that unifies us and therefore is necessary in order to address?
It unifies and separates at the same time.
Well, that's my question. I mean, and you know, how do you direct it in one direction rather than the other? And you know, education could be one of them, and of course a part of it. But you know, how you bring up your children? Do you bring them up as English, or do you bring them up as German, or do you bring them up as both? And how do you go about doing that?
Well, I think it's important in a sense that we only have national identities which are competing, as we had centuries along, competing national identities. That is a problem, and that's what Europe tried to overcome.
True.
And if you read the early speeches and statements of Monnet, but also Hallstein, the first president of the Commission, I mean, they wanted to do away with nations, in a way, with nationalism. Nationalism was the biggest enemy. If you read these statements now, they seem totally utopian. No one would even say this in Sunday speeches anymore, what Monnet and Hallstein and these sort of founding fathers of the European Union have said. But I think they are right, and we should revisit these things. But I think we should give it time. I don't think we should create an agency or a union on identity. We will get there. I'm optimistic. On use, I think it's a big issue because, for me, the UK showed the youth was on totally the other side than the older people. So in a sense, that makes you optimistic because, there will be a biological solution to it over time. So that's my way of dealing with it. I think you are in the most unnormal state, Germany. You have a repoliticalization of the youth in nearly every aspect. And you have an emerging sort of a new European movement. This is a pulse of Europe, which is quite strange. People go on central squares and wave European flags. Actually, the first time I saw this was in London after Brexit. There was a big demonstration. Suddenly, the whole of London was full with European flags. I mean, it's also a question of identity building. So sometimes you need shocks to the system. And then the last question about economics, I think, is very important because I think it's a big misconception that Europe was created as an economic project. But everyone is talking about it, and I don't understand it. This is a totally political project. Economics was only a tool, but people mix it up. I mean, even serious people mix it up and say, oh, it was created economics, and now we have to make it a political. No, it was always a political project, and economics, and this was, I think that was one of the most creative ideas of the Monnets of this world, to use economics as an instrument. And get them together and make sure. I call it in my book, this was the first sharing economy. Now we talk all about sharing economy, very cool people, Airbnb and these kind of guys. And while they are really cool, the real first sharing economy, the European Union, looks old-fashioned and is in crisis. And I think there's something wrong. Why don't we and that's the question for me for storytelling. I tell the story of the European Union as a sharing economy, which is now on a way to become a sharing society. So then you can also attract younger people. They say, sharing economy, yeah, cool stuff. Uber, Airbnb, and you get a totally different language. And I think there's a lot into it, into this sharing economy on the way to a sharing society. And of course, Europe is much more than economics. It's football, it's architecture, it's a wonderful country, sort of landscapes, and so it's the greatest place on earth, according to me. Well, Trump would say something first. In that sense, I think Europe is great. It doesn't need to be great again because it is great, but we should tell the story about the greatness of Europe much more often, not only economically, but also in many other spheres, Biennale. Some people like the Eurovision Song Contest, and maybe the gentleman at the end saying, you know, we should look at space and the European Space Agency maybe. I think we have a lot to do still here before we roam around in space. And the main message for me is if we start to talk more optimistically, more positively about Europe, we will start to believe in it and maybe create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a very good message to finish in. You started by saying that 2017 will be the turning point. When we celebrate the 70 years from the signing of Treaty of Rome, I will hold you accountable to that.
Maybe
then,
I want to leave you with one thing. I also looked at the issue of Germany. And 15 years ago, Germany was the sick man of Europe. And every problem seemed huge in Germany. You know, unemployment, economics, everything. It was a gray country. After the exuberance of unification, you had a big fall. And then you had the Sommermärchen, the World Cup. Germany was only third, people forget. But and from then it went upwards again. It was, in a sense, a feeling of optimism, and that drove Germany. And I think. Sorry.
Okay, we can.
Anyway, I think the same could happen to Europe. The same could happen to Europe.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Please join me in thanking.